Politics. And she's the director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Her talk is from the title of her book, Russian Hackers, Trolls, and Hashtag Democracy RIP. Okay, so that's coming up on March 10th at 7 p.m. right here at Knight Law School. So if you have bandwidth, I hope you can join us for that. We also have on our table outside of this hall some other events that hopefully you might take a peek at and consider joining us for. But right now, let's start. Let's turn to, of course, our scholar of the hour, Dr. Colin Koopman. Koopman is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Oregon and director of the New Media and Culture program. He's a prolific scholar, authoring dozens of articles and essays on pragmatist philosophy, genealogical philosophy, and the politics, history, and ethics of data. He's also the author of 3 books, Pragmatism as Transition, Historicity, and Hope in James, Dewey, and Morty. A second book called Genealogy as Critique, Foucault and the Problems of Modernity. And the focus of his talk tonight, titled How We Became Our Data, a genealogy of the informational person, an exciting new work published by the University of Chicago Press. Colin has been a great friend of the Wayne Moore Center, contributing to lots of key thematic programs and events. And I think it's also especially fitting that he's giving this talk with us today because he received the Research Scholar Award from our center for an enticing project at the time that was titled Info Politics that helped launch this book. For several years, Colin and I had classes that were linked through a written grant. Mine was a class on policy and democracy, and Colin's was a class called Justice Matters. And from that experience, I learned that he's not only a really talented and accomplished scholar, but he's also a gifted and beloved teacher. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing about his latest book, How We Became Our Data. So please join me in welcoming Colin Koopman.
Good evening, everybody. Dan mentioned that this work started a number of years ago under a different title of Info Politics, and since I'm giving this talk at my home university, I would be remiss not to thank the many units and organizations on campus that have made this book and hence this talk possible. And first and foremost, I'm really glad to and grateful to be able to give this talk here at the Wayne Moore Center, because this research project really got on its way through support from the Wayne Moore Center. Back when it looked very different and was a project on the history of privacy law, what you'll be hearing about tonight is not the history of privacy law, but nevertheless part of the backstory of why privacy matters. Other units on campus that I just have to briefly mention that help support this project: the Oregon Humanities Center, the Williams Fund, the Vice Provost for Research and Innovation, the Provost's Office, the College of Arts and Sciences Humanities Summer Stipend. And I'm grateful to all of those units for their support. There are also a number of people in the room who have, in many ways, supported this project and supported me through this project. If I were to name them all, we'd be here for another 15 minutes, so I will pass on that. However, you know, scholars like myself, we trot over the country, we trot over the globe, giving talks here and there, and we're often not given the opportunity to give talks like this on our local campus, on our home turf, and we're often therefore not given the opportunity to thank the people who really sustain us in the deepest ways. And I'm very grateful that my wife Caroline is here tonight. And I'm grateful for her, not only for all the life sustenance, but really as pertinent to this book and this project. Caroline has suffered through, perhaps occasionally enjoyed many discussions, debates, arguments over the dinner table about info politics, heard many different formulations of this project, and allowed me to nerd out over such things as finding the only copy in the country of a manual for a 1920s personality test and having it delivered to me through interlibrary loan and just being excited that I got this thing.
And then we got to take it together, which was really fun.
Yeah, so thank you, Caroline. Much appreciated, of course, obviously. So I'm here to talk about this book project that I recently completed. Once my slides come to order. The title of the book is How We Became Our Data. And what I'm really focused on in the book is the relationship between our data, ourselves, and the politics and ethics of all of this. I assume that you're in this room in part because you care about these topics, you have concern for these topics. Maybe like myself, certainly myself 7 or 8 years ago when I began working on this, but even myself today, you are mystified about and perplexed about politics of data and ethics of data. For me, this book really got going reflecting upon the Snowden affair and the Snowden revelations, and the fact that there was this sort of instant uproar and alarm that we all felt about this illegitimate, unsupervised, unauthorized mass surveillance, both of persons globally, but also American citizens. And that said, the real scandal of the Snowden affair is that after 3 or 4 months, everything just went quiet, and we all went back to what we were doing anyway. And that, for me, really signifies that there's a need for a fuller conversation, but really a fuller understanding of these kinds of issues. We both have an alarm about it, but then we just drift back into complacency, and not because we don't care, but because in many ways we feel powerless about what to do about all of this high technology. So my book, again, is about data, ourselves, and how our data has become political. Let me just say at the outset what I mean and what I don't mean by this term political. I'm interested in the book in the history of the politics of data, but I'm not really focused on, and I'm not going to give a talk tonight about social movements around data. I'm not going to talk about policy, regulatory agencies, how legislatures and parliaments in different parts of the world have or have not regulated data. Rather, I'm interested in a sort of prior moment. I'm interested in a kind of prior theoretical question. Both questions are important. I think we need more histories of the politics of data in the sense of legislatures, social movements, etc. But I'm interested in this prior question of how data itself became a political concern. How is it that back in 2012, one of our local representatives, Peter DeFazio, would visit a class of mine titled Internet Society and Philosophy and give a talk to my students in that class about then proposed SOPA legislation, the Stop Online Piracy Act. How is it that data policy would become something that would be of such interest to a sitting congressman? When, if you go back 100 years, you're hard-pressed to find anything like that. So the kinds of things that I'm thinking about in thinking about how we became people whose data can be a political and ethical issue, things that we're all familiar with. Just sort of take the latest headline story from tech and the tech industry. Social media manipulation, mass privacy breaches, Target, Equifax, Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, etc. More broadly, also issues like the politics of documentation. How could something like a document, how could a scrap of paper come to mean so much to the life chances of somebody who is trying to live in this country? So I'm going to tell a story about the history of the politics of data. And I delve into history because I think it shows that our being defined by our data is a much longer story than we commonly think. Tech likes to present itself as new, as newly new, as really fresh, as something that's always changing, always updating. But I think the history of data and the history of data politics is longer than we're commonly encouraged to believe. And understanding that longer story, to give away the conclusion here at the outset, yields both good news and bad news. So the bad news is that we are much more deeply entrenched in our information than we commonly think. And I think it's just not possible for us to get outside of some of the thorny problems and challenges that we face by, for instance, something so quick and easy as deleting our Facebook app, though I would recommend that. But I don't think that actually solves many of our problems. It might solve some small problems for you and I. So the bad news is we're really deeply entrenched in data, and this longer history shows that. The good news is that our deep immersion in data turns out to depend on some very basic assumptions and some very basic decisions that I think are much more tractable than we're commonly invited to think when we think about the politics of data. And I think all of us, even if you're not a coder, not a programmer, even if you consider yourself low-tech in the face of all this high-tech in front of you, all of us, I think, can reflectively and ethically engage with some of the rudimentary technologies that have long been at the heart of our data and have long been at the heart of who we are. So, let me start off then by contextualizing this. Let me just kind of set a frame in terms of how I'm approaching these questions. The title of my book, again, is How We Became Our Data. Nested in that is a provocation that we have become our data, that we are our data. So let me just state at the outset, I don't mean that in the sense that we are only our data. I would not make the claim that we are just data. Rather, my claim is that we are data too. We are also data. Data are one of the many layers of who we are. We are our bodies, we are our minds, we are, if you want them, our souls. We are also our data. We live through our data. And take, for me, one of the most obvious examples that seems counterintuitive until you think about it. Think about the technology of your name. Your name is a data point. You often don't encourage yourself to think about it as a data point, but it is. To your doctor, to your banker, to your employer's accountants, to your university's registrar. Just try interacting with any of these organizations or institutions or bureaucrats without giving your name, or giving the wrong name, or spelling your name incorrectly. They just won't know what to do with you. They just won't be able to handle you. You live through your name as a very specified, particular, formalized technology. Now, more broadly than your name, think of all that credentialing that you carry around in this friendly little guy. Your Facebook login, your email address and password, your Twitter login, your bank account numbers, your PayPal and Venmo, your credit card data, your Bitcoin wallets. Think more broadly of all the data identifiers, not only in your phone, but all the data-defining paperwork that's also in your wallet. Think about all of the data that defines you, that you carry around with you whenever you go out into the world to do anything. Think about how difficult it would be to do any of those things without those data. Think about, again, showing up at the bank, or the doctor's office, or just about anywhere where you try to conduct some important transaction without your data, without the proof that shows who you are. So it's in this sense that we have become our data. A significant share of our lives, a significant and non-trivial aspect of our lives depends on data in an important way. So the question that I'm interested in then is this: how did we become kinds of persons who live through so much data? And when did we become these kinds of persons? Obviously, it's not, as it were, inbuilt into human physiology or biology that we must transact ourselves through so much data. If you take a long enough historical survey, certainly go back 200 years, very few people are living their lives through data. Really, I mentioned the technology of the name. The technology of the name in which we practice it today is a sort of stable identifier that uniquely applies to you, that you don't just get to change willy-nilly. This is something that goes back in most of the North Atlantic countries, US, Western Europe, only about 125, 130 years. Of course, there are people with our standard names prior to that, but the name becomes a universal technology. It becomes something that's obligatory. It becomes something that you must have. You must be able to present yourself through, really only in the early 1900s. So how did that kind of technology, how did these other kinds of technologies become so integral to who we are? So there are a few reasonable, but I think bad answers to this question. The sort of standard answer that you'll hear is that our present data selves, our informational personhood, was born in the era of Web 2.0, that halcyon decade from the late 90s to the late aughts, when Facebook, social media, all this stuff took off. We all installed it onto ourselves, and we became data selves. That's fine so far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far as an answer to the question about when we became our data, because this really dehistoricizes data. It takes data out of its longer historical context, as if social media did not have historical conditions. The question that I would ask is, how is it that, why is it that so many people were so eager to take up social media in this decade? Okay? This answer also has the unfortunate quality of being the answer that's purveyed by the marketing departments down in Silicon Valley. So as a matter of professorial principle, if I'm studying the history of technology, I don't want to be reproducing the answers that you're hearing from Apple, Alphabet, Facebook, etc. If you believe that, they're already telling it to you amply. You're hearing this all the time. So this is really the answer that I think many of us start with, and I want to kind of push things further back and say, we need to go further back. And historians who've looked at this question have gone further back. Most historians go back to this golden year, 1948. This is the year in which the man on your left, Claude Shannon, a Bell Labs engineer, published a famous paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. Also in that same year, the man on your right, Norbert Wiener, published the book Cybernetics. Also in this year, George Orwell was working on his famous novel of information dystopia that you all know so well, 1984. That novel was published in 1949. He was working on it in 1948, and the title was taken from a transposition of the year 1948 in 1984, which is also a kind of transposition or coding that only becomes possible in a moment in which even an author as well steeped in history and in culture broadly as George Orwell was, would think to name his novel in that way. So this is the consensus answer, and again, I don't so much want to disagree with the historians who push this argument, but there's a question that we can ask about this answer. Why is it that so many people, why is it that so many Americans, let me restrict my story to the United States, were eager to take up Wiener, Shannon, Orwell, and the like? Why is it that there was what James Baldwin would later call a cybernetics craze in the early 50s? And we need to ask why information theory of Claude Shannon on the left and cybernetic visions of Norbert Wiener on the right were so widely embraced in 1948. Again, why was there this uptake? Why was there this excitement? In the same way that we can ask that question about why was there this excitement about Facebook and social media in the early aughts. So I kind of want to push things back a couple decades to the decades in which Shannon and Wiener were coming of age. And really the decades in which all their later enthusiasts were coming of age. What was going on in people's lives in the teens and 20s and 30s that wasn't going on in the lives of people who were coming of age in the late 19th century? What was new in the teens and 20s and 30s? What was emerging? What was solidifying, stabilizing in the teens, 20s, and 30s? Such that we would have the emergence of first-generation data subjects in those decades. So that's kind of where I situate the story that I want to offer you all tonight. And I focus on these years because this is when we, I think, finally arrive at the present that we still live in. If you were to go back much further than the early 20th century, if you were to go back into the 19th century, you would find data, but you'd find a wilderness of data. You would find a mess of data. You wouldn't find stable, reliable, and soon to become obligatory practices of data. You wouldn't find reliable, stable technologies of data that everybody is increasingly expected to live their lives through. So those technologies are really installed in the first decade of the 20th century. These years exhibit what I like to call the turbulent moment of emergence of the relentless datafication that we are still caught up in today. They are what I like to call the cusp of consolidation. We're on the cusp of consolidation in these decades. And just to give a couple examples of this before I kind of dig into the story, if you think again about all that extensive credentialing I mentioned a few minutes ago, that credentialing, what I offered at the beginning is almost kind of a cliche. I mean, we all know to sort of think about and trot out all the stuff that we carry around in our pockets. And so here's a quote for you. Every law-abiding citizen today has his vast pockets crammed with credentials, a draft registration card, a social security card, a driver's license, a hospitalization card, an insurance card, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Practically all of these stress the fact that I am me and nobody else. Without them, I would officially cease to exist. Here's Weir Holbrook in 1942 making my point 75 some years in advance of me. We are our data. Without them, I would officially cease to exist. This quote, by the way, is from a fantastic book by the historian Sarah Igo, who gave a talk here a number of years ago and has since been back to visit both the Morse Center and other venues on campus. Her book is called The Known Citizen. I highly, highly recommend it. Fantastic book, very readable, very long, and very readable. As any good history book is, it's a long one. And this is an image that Sarah first turned me onto. Okay, this is a Dorothy Lang photograph taken August 17th, 1939, right here in the Willamette Valley. To be precise, in West Staten, a township that I have never been to, but it's just east of what is now I-5 between Albany and Salem. This is a migrant timber worker and farmer named Thomas Cave, at the time age 27. And what's interesting about this photograph from 1937 is if you look at the tattoo on his arm, on his bicep, which he's proudly displaying, if you think back a second ago to his smile. When did this become possible? When did it become possible for somebody to tattoo their social security number, to tattoo their identifier on their bicep? I mean, in one sense, the answer to this question is trivial. It became possible really only the year before because that's when social security enumeration began. But the kind of non-trivial question I'm asking is, when did it become possible for somebody to so proudly identify with their identifiers? And it's precisely in these decades, the teens, 20s, and 30s. So what I want to sort of take you through now is the history that made somebody like Thomas Cave in this photograph possible. And to take you through this history, let me start here. This is a tree. In my research, and I'm not going to go too academic here, but I'm happy to in the Q&A, I make use of a philosophical method called genealogy. Now, you don't need to know anything about philosophical methods or genealogy in the philosophical sense to sort of stick with me through this metaphor. I take this image of a tree because I think it resonates with what all of you already know about genealogy. When you hear the word genealogy, you think family trees. And family trees are not all that bad of a metaphor for genealogy in the scholarly philosophical sense, though I do hear some of my colleagues distant across the country gasping right now that I would boil down this philosophical method, on which I wrote a whole book, by the way, prior to this one, to something like a family tree. But I think it's a helpful metaphor, provided we make one small qualification. The trees in a genealogy must be rhizomatic. And that's a botanical term, of course, for plants that reproduce through the root system primarily, rather than reproducing through cone, seed, etc. So if you've been hiking in some of the high forests out in the west, specifically southern Oregon, northern California, and the Rockies, you'll know the tree Populus tremuloides. This is the quaking aspen. When you're out there in an aspen forest, you're standing in the middle of one giant organism. Okay, when you walk up in the forest here in the Willamette Valley, up in the Cascades, and you walk through a Doug fir forest or hemlocks, These are many different organisms. Here's one organism here, here's another one over here. Don't bump into the trees, don't ski into the trees, right? But when you're in a quaking aspen forest, it's all one organism underneath. It's a shared root structure. And genealogy, in that sense of a tree, is a good metaphor, or trees in that rhizomatic sense, so that shared root structure sense, that's a good metaphor for genealogy. So hopefully I can make good on this metaphor as I go. So what I do in the book is I trace across a number of chapters different growths of the formation of data subjectivity, different growths of the formation of what I call informational personhood, or how we come to live through our data. I have a chapter on psychometrics and the emergence in this era of intelligence testing and personality testing. I have a chapter on the deification of race, which speaks to a broader deification of the body, and I'm really interested in this chapter in the way in which race gets turned into the long history of race. You can think of the history of race in the history of this country, how this, in the precise moment in which Jim Crow is kind of at some of its heights, race is something that gets turned into data. Jim Crow dissipates, but the datafication of race persists, and you get projects like redlining, which is a 1930s to 1940s government-backed, U.S. government-backed project in basically unequal distribution of wealth benefits. And I'm happy to talk about that in more detail as we go. There's also in this era data-driven health, data-centric biology. We've all heard the metaphor of the genetic code. It's actually not a metaphor. When Watson and Crick published their famous articles on double helix in 1953, they take it for granted. They don't even argue. They take it for granted that genes are information transfer units. That's how they define a gene. I think most of us tend to think of our genes as like physical stuff, but the way in which they're actually conceptualized, the way in which they're actually scientifically operationalized, going all the way back to 1953, is as data, as information. So there's all kinds of scientific and economic ways in which data is defining people in this period. And I'm going to focus on my chapter on documentary identities, tell you a little bit about that. And specifically, I want to focus on the birth certificate. And I want to focus on the birth certificate for two reasons. First, think of that credentialing that you carry around with you. All of it depends on your birth certificate. All of it depends on what the technologists call your breeder document. It's the document, I guess, that shows that somebody bred and produced you, but it's really the document from which all the other documentation that you have is bred. All of our documentation depends on the birth certificate. And this is why each of you here either has a birth certificate or does not have one, but knows how seriously burdened those who do not have one can be and tend to be. So how do we become persons again for whom a scrap of paper like this would matter so much? The second reason that for me birth certificates are interesting is they're perched at this very precise historical moment. And let me just give you some context here. So it takes 30 years, 1903 to 1933, to standardize the birth certificate in the United States. The census, the American Public Health Association, the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, a whole bunch of organizations kind of get together in 1903 and they decide, we're going to standardize the birth certificate. Okay, prior to this moment, and for a few decades after, it's just not the case that everybody would have a birth certificate. And it's certainly not the case that employers or other government agencies would rely on or expect people to have birth certificates. It took 30 years to achieve standardized birth registration in a way that the census and other organizations deemed successful. And their measure for success was 90% registration of newly born babies. So that's 1903 to 1933. Almost immediately after, in the winter of 1936 to 1937, it takes the Social Security Board only 6 months to achieve 90% registration of American workers. Okay, so you go from taking 30 years to achieve 90% registration of a population to 6 months to achieve 90% registration of admittedly a different population, but a very large population. We were talking all eligible American workers. So what then is the history of the birth certificate? And what can we learn from the history of the birth certificate? I will not bore you, or entice some of you, with all of the details of the nitty-gritty, dirty historical research that I dug through in order to dig out the history of the birth certificate. Let me just kind of mention a few things that would be on the surface of the historical record for anybody who went to look. These are things that any of you would find if you dug into the libraries in the same way that I did. You'd find a story about the emergence of new forms of knowledge in the early 20th century in which the birth certificate is caught up. Demographic sciences, public health drives, actuarial estimates, et cetera, et cetera. You'd find a story about political campaigns, including public health campaigns, and this is a very important one, to lower infant mortality. You'd find new legislation to restrict working age. You'd find age-based labor regulations. You'd find social measure efforts on the part of the Census Bureau. You'd also find, again, in a very humdrum, ordinary, everyday sense, just on the surface of the historical record, you can find this in book after book after book in this period, being published in this period. You'd find the emergence of things like eligible child laborers, eligible beneficiaries, legal title holders. These are all things that birth certificates are useful for. They're useful for not only registering a person, but showing that you qualify to work, that you are a certain age. How are you going to prove what age you are if you don't have a birth certificate? How are you going to prove what lineage you have so that you can draw some benefit without a birth certificate? How are you going to prove your title without a birth certificate? So birth certificates are caught up in, and they help fuel all of these developments in this period. And all of this is interesting, and I'd love to talk about this at detail, but I really want to draw your attention down to the roots, because it's the roots that interest me. So here's where my metaphor comes into play. What we have when we look at the depth roots of all the things that were unfurling in the early 20th century, be it birth certificates or data-driven health records or the datafication of race or psychometrics, is a story about science and knowledge being an increasingly data-driven enterprise. We also have at the roots a story about the emergence of new exercises of power, new forms of politics, new forms of managing persons, new forms of people being subject to the workings of power, for good or for ill. And what I'm really interested in is the story about how in the installation of data technology across all of these domains, from identity papers to health records to psychometrics to datafication of race and economic context, how we get people being inscribed into formats. Formats that were designed by technologists who put into place, put into operation the forms that we are today all so familiar with. We're all familiar with filling out these forms, living our lives through these forms. But what are the formats of these forms? How do these formats work? Do they work equally for all of us? Do they always work equally for all of us? These formats fasten us. I use this term fasten to describe the operation of the politics here in a double sense. They both tie us down and they speed us up. Forms pin us down to the fields on the form, and they also speed up and quicken our interaction with the institution, the organization, the bureaucracy. This, of course, there's a resonance for this today in all the social media apps installed on your phone. You install the app, you log in, and you create a profile according to a prefab set of formats. You fill out a form on your Facebook account. I am this, I am that, I am this. That you get fastened to, right? Think about 12-year-olds doing this, 13-year-olds doing this. Think about yourself doing this back when you first did this. You get fastened to these data points. And they also fasten you in the sense of quickening you, as attested by your phones right now, which you can check now or later when you leave, and all the notifications you've received, all the invitations to interact with me, interact with me, interact with me, right? So we have this quickened interaction, but according to these prefab formats. And we get, in the context of all of this, the birth of what I call, again, informational persons, or data subjects. So I'm really interested in these roots, these deeper roots, as they work across domains, okay? That said, there's another part of the tree that I need to talk about, and that's the trunk. Trees have roots, they have the leaves up top, and they have the trunk. And the trunk is what mediates between the depths of the assumptions that drive knowledge and politics and persons in this period, and all of the things that you would see just if you had your eyes open back in the teens, 20s, and 30s, all of the things that are the leaves of my tree here. So what mediates between, what establishes a connection between those deep roots, between the power of forms and formats to fasten us to who they are and are becoming something like a registered baby, or an eligible child laborer, or an eligible beneficiary, or any of the other things that we are that we show through our data. So what ties these things together is technology. Technologies in a broad sense. And I don't mean technologies here in the sense of high tech or what's new technology. I mean technologies in a broader sense of things that are crafted by persons, things that are artificed by persons, things that are made by persons. So let me just give some examples and talk about 3 technologies that were crucial to the birth certificate. And I'll be quick here. Standard forms, filing protocols, and data audits. These are essential to the successful installation of the birth certificate technology in the U.S. context, 1903 to 1933. And these are technologies that, at the time that I'm looking at here, back in the early 20th century, these are new things. The people designing these technologies, they're doing something that in many instances haven't been done before. Okay, the registration of workers by the Social Security Board, this is really like the first big data project. Prior to that, you had this other big data project of developing a standardized system of birth registration to register 90% of babies in every U.S. state. So you have standard forms like this, like the one we saw before. This is the model certificate of birth. It was used as a basis for what are now, or what were then standard birth certificates in every U.S. state, and all of the birth certificates that we have now are kind of later developments of this kind of form. So you have standard forms. Again, this stuff is all familiar to us now, but what's important is that if you go back behind this, you're not going to find something like these standard forms. You're not going to find people being registered on standard forms, babies being registered on standard forms. You also have filing protocols. You have a shift in technology as registration moves from, it used to be called the book index system, where they basically write down this baby was born in a book like this, to something that's much more familiar, to something that we all sort of see all the time today in terms of filing cabinets. And if you don't work in an office context in which you see this, you certainly see this on your computer all the time. Okay. And then we have what to me is the most interesting technology developed in this period, technology of data audits. This is Julia Lathrop. She is the first female head of a U.S. federal agency. The Children's Bureau was founded in 1912. Lathrop was its first director. And Lathrop and her largely female force of civil servants at the Children's Bureau were able to do what a number of federal agencies had been trying to do for a decade prior, which was develop a successful audit or test or measure of birth registration. And if you think about it, it's actually a really difficult problem. How are you going to know if you're successful at registering babies, registering born persons, if there's not already a registry of born persons? You can't just say, oh, well, we have 500 registered babies in this county. Let's compare that to how many babies were born in this county. You don't have a count of how many babies were born in this county. That's precisely what birth registration is about, is developing this way of tabulating persons. And Lathrop and her team were able to do this. through basically a house-to-house canvas of knocking on doors, was there a baby born, did you register this baby, etc. There's a much longer history to this. There's a longer story about this, including the way in which once Lathrop and the Children's Bureau were able to achieve a successful data audit method, it was kind of stolen away from them by the then mostly male Census Bureau. So there's a very interesting gendered history to these data technologies, which is not entirely unresonant with what we find today. But let me talk about some of the broader resonances with contemporary data technologies. And then I'll quickly wrap up. So I want to just bring us now into the present, with which you are all familiar, and just suggest ways in which some of our newest and most captivating and most alarming deployments of data technology really overlap with what we begin to see emerging in the early 20th century. And what we find today is what we found back then. We find standard formats, storage protocols, and data audits as central to the development of big data, data science, data tech, etc. Standard formats like the OSA model for internet architecture, or this is the standard format that you all know so well. Whether you have a Facebook account or not, you certainly already recognize this as the kind of thing onto which so many other people in this room, you being the exception, have loaded themselves. Storage protocols. Again, we find ways in which storage and processing and transmission of data becomes an issue, as well as access to what's stored, or non-access to what is stored, including data about me, which is stored in server farm after server farm after server farm across the country, to which I do not have access because Facebook or Amazon owns it. And again, that's true for all of you. And then we also have all kinds of data audits. All kinds of ways of measuring the success of these data projects. And interestingly here, we have beginnings of a twist to the story. And we have different kinds of audits. In addition to the sort of quality audits for testing, how well are we measuring such and such, we also have the audits that give rise to front page scandals with which I began. So we have this resonance in these kinds of technologies from the early 20th century to today. And let me now just kind of wrap up by asking this question. Why does all this matter anyway? Why should we care about this history of data? I mean, certainly for me, it's of enormous historical interest. I love digging around in these dusty books. But, how do I justify that? How do we justify caring about these kinds of histories of technology? So I want to suggest that it matters in two ways. It matters in terms of diagnosing where we are in the present, locating where we are in the present, and it matters in terms of looking forward to our future. And these both bear on, again, all the sort of front page data scandals that we all know about, as well as the non-front page data scandals that we don't know about, but perhaps we should. So, in terms of diagnosing our present, locating where we are, the resonances between today and the early 20th century, these help us see how our technological and political present was formed. They help us see, again, the roots out of which our present is grown. They help us see that the formats of all these standard forms really began to define and program us about 100 years ago. And that defining and programming is something that we've now been entrenched in for multiple generations. Again, there's this sort of, again, bad news to this story, is that it's not so easy as uninstalling an app or just convincing the next generation to not install the app. It's something that even before any of us in this room heard of Facebook, we were all caught up in. We were all caught up in these standard formats. We were all being fastened to these formats. So our past makes tractable, I think, some of the very basic technological underpinnings of today's uber-complex technologies. So then we can look forward from that, because I think that recognizing that helps us engage our present on terms that are relevant to its transformation. It helps us, to stick with my metaphor, cultivate better roots. It helps us engage the roots, tend to the roots of where we find ourselves. And rather than assuming that today's algorithms are too hyper-complex for us to assess, and certainly for many in this room, myself included, they are. I don't code. I don't dig into the complicated technologies of the algorithms that operate when I'm using Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, there are basic underlying, much more basic underlying technologies on which those algorithms depend. And I think we have a site of entry into thinking about reflectively engaging, cultivating better roots for our data politics and our data ethics in terms of these formats, which are very tractable. It's very easy to think about ways in which formats on a form tie us down, speed us up, even if you don't know the sort of latest Python programming in terms of the algorithms that are built on top of those formats. So what I suggest is that we need an ethics of formats. We need a politics and an ethics of formats. And what would that look like? And here I'm going to be mainly suggestive. I will admit up front that the book is more focused on that kind of diagnostic side of things. I don't really lay out in any detail what I'm about to talk about here. But I think that it's incumbent upon somebody who writes a book like the book that I wrote to not only think about the past and to try to make sense of the problems that define our data today, but also to try to reflectively rework these problems, to try to reflectively remediate some of these problems. And even if that's not incumbent upon me, certainly we as a society need both the diagnosers and the prognosticators. We need both the people who can sort of help us understand the problems that we have and the people who can help us fix them. So in terms of how we fix them, I have some tentative suggestions, and then I'm happy to discuss much more in the Q&A. I think we need something like a guiding principle. We need something like an account of fairness in data, an account of fairness in data that would help us focus on equality as something that's basic to our society and basic to the ways in which we treat one another. So what I'm thinking about here is something like an imperative to design data systems that minimize the disadvantages and burdens differentially placed on disadvantaged groups. And that's probably, that's not really too much to ask, but that's something that's very far from Facebook's radar. Facebook is not thinking about what are the impacts of our latest technology going to be on our user base, specifically with respect to distribution of burdens on already disadvantaged groups and societies. That's not that complicated of a question, but it's a question that Facebook does not want to ask. Facebook is not encouraged to ask. And I think we need to think about a tech environment in which that question is featured more prominently. And in addition to guiding principles, we also need pragmatic tools, and we need something like data audits to assess these disparate impacts of data technology, even when it's not transparent. And I think with a principle like this and tools like these, and I certainly don't want to insist that these are the only principles and tools that we need, we can begin to address issues like data privacy, algorithmic bias, and mass disinformation as the Russian Internet Research Agency prepares once again to hack another election. So how do we do this? There are, I think, three legs to the stool of an ethics of format. There's the law and policy. There's the regulation angle. We need better law. We need better regulation. There's the technology angle, values and design, embedding in our actual technologies, for instance, embedding in defaults. What are the default settings on Facebook? What are the default settings when you fill out your prefab form, when you say who you are? We can think about those through values questions, through questions of ethics. And then, of course, there's the project that I'm committed to as a professor and a teacher here at the University of Oregon, project of education. So with that, I'll bring myself to a stop here, and I'm happy to discuss Q&A, any questions. So, thank you all.
So if you want to ask questions, we have a microphone here. Just to tell you, the way that we do the microphone at the Wayne Morse Center is we don't hand it over because we political scientists, we worry about filibustering. So the person will hold the microphone for you, just so you know. So if you want to ask a question for Colin, raise your hand. And while Abby is finding you, there's a few breaks right there. I want you to know that there are 8 copies of this book that Colin has put on sale right outside.
My publisher.
Publishers put on sale right outside the door. I think you can get 30% off. Although this might be, a great opportunity to have a bidding war since there's only 8. So I'll just say that. But anyway, so if you like the copy, it's right outside on the table.
Are there any linguistic statements about ourselves that can't be reduced to data? And if so, how does it impact our sense of ourselves, at least as public selves?
So if I hear your question correctly, you're asking if there are aspects of who we are that are not reducible to these data systems? Linguistic statements. Yes, I think there are true linguistic statements about us that are not reducible to data in the sense in which I'm talking about it. I also think there are multiple aspects of who we are that are not reducible to data. So my claim, again, is not that we are just our data, but it's that we are our data also. And there's, a lot of the data politics and data ethics literature, especially from the discipline of philosophy, although there's not all that much, there's kind of a worry that people have about the reductive tendencies of data. You can think of some aspect of yourself that you're just like, that cannot be captured by data. So sure, I'm fine with that. But I don't think that most data technologists or data scientists are claiming to capture all of us anyway. They're rather trying to model us for certain purposes that they believe are useful. So rather than getting worried about the way in which data reduces away or can't account for all of who we are, which is I think a common refrain, I'm more interested in thinking about how can we be more reflective about the data models we're building such that we can measure one data model off of another, such that we can ask which data model is reducing us, which parts of us in which way, or which data model is better serving different parts of us. But that's a great, there's a lot of debate about that issue.
Hi, Colin. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very, very beautiful. So I have a question about your guiding principle, which you have in your last slide. Because it seems to me that the internet itself was kind of conceptualized with the end-to-end principle, the neutrality principle, and people thought that these principles were enough to ensure that both equality and fairness were made into the infrastructure of this communication method, right? And now we can see how much of a massive failure that was, right? And so I'm thinking about what other kinds of ideas are you having when you say we need a guiding principles, because those guiding principles built the infrastructure and they still failed us. The E2E and the neutrality principle particularly.
Yeah, so to me then, that question, and I fully agree with everything you're saying there, and to me, that's really the question right now in terms of what do we do with all these messes that we're in with all these data technologies. And I would think about it less as something that's, as it were, already there in something like internet architecture in terms of the way in which it's agnostic about what kinds of data it can transmit. And I would think about it more in terms of those 3 stools. And we're probably at a moment now where the law policy leg of the stool needs to bear some additional weight, because pretty much right now, that leg of the stool bears almost no weight. We're in almost a zero regulation environment with a lot of these things, which, if you think about it, is incredibly strange, because we're talking about the largest market cap companies in the United States, and really, in some ways, the largest market cap companies among the largest market cap companies in the world, and the regulations that bear down upon them are exceedingly minimal. And that's just like an odd kind of political conjunction to to find ourselves in sort of all of a sudden. So I really think we need sort of a richer suite of law and policy. But there is, I think, room to build in better defaults into the technologies. But that needs to be more kind of values and design driven project rather than this is a happy side effect of the way in which we sort of wrote the original internet architecture project. If that makes sense, yeah.
If you have questions, raise your hand so we can see you. We don't mind making our way to the left side, too.
Okay, this is the Cambridge Analytica question. You have a very complex algorithm for developing psychological profiles on people that was originally designed to cool out, as it were, people who were inclined towards terroristic sympathies. And instead what you have is a few very powerful people, and a few very powerful corporations like Google and Facebook that have allowed the weaponization of this information so that we produce this amazing political dysfunction, whether it's Brexit or the Tea Party or whatever. And how can you get to the point of regulating this data in a situation where you have a destabilized political structure?
I take it that you're skeptical that we can get there?
Right now, yes.
Well, I'm skeptical that we can get there right now because right now we're not there. But I mean, I don't think it's an option to be skeptical that we can get there in the near term. I mean, I don't take it to be an option that we're just going to sort of persist in the current regulation minimal environment. And if I went sort of looking about for reeds of hope, I would turn to, Silicon Valley is an interesting place because it's populated by all these people who are excited to work at companies like Alphabet, Google, because, they have this like, don't be evil motto. And, they really believe, that was the last, as Ramon was mentioning in the last question, they really believe these technologies are liberating. Now, they may have been wrong about that, but they were drawn to this space. They were drawn to these careers and these careers around these technologies because of the social promise that they saw in them. It may have been somewhat short-sighted, but I don't think it was entirely naive to think that, these technologies can connect us in ways that don't have to be harmful. Although I think right now many of the connections they're making are causing all kinds of harms. So I think you're asking a much more basic question about what motivates political hope versus what motivates political skepticism. And, maybe we need to sort of get a political psychologist into the room. I don't really have a question for that or an answer to that other than to say that for me, hopelessness cannot be an option. We have to have hope around this. I can't, as James Baldwin said in a very different context, but again related to this context in terms of the longer history of the datafication of race, you can't tell the children there's no hope. We just have to sort of muster our hopefulness to these things. And I see a lot of energy for people wanting to move in this direction. So. Hi.
Hi. So I think if I got it right, that you were saying we should care because of diagnosis and prognosis. And given that big data has completely captured the zone of prediction, could you say a little more about the kind of prognosis that we should be caring about? Because it seems like we're so boxed in with predictive algorithms generated by big data that there isn't really an ethical pathway open.
I guess I would not take such a dim view of our current predicament, though I do agree with you that we find ourselves in a very sticky moment, but I don't think it makes, to me, it doesn't resonate to say that, big data has completely captured the zone of prediction. I mean, I think about there are all walks of life and all manner of domains in which we live, in which predictive instruments are being used in ways that aren't as obviously problematic as what's going on when the Russian Internet Research Agency, hacks a democratic election, or when Equifax loses the personal data of half of the people in this room and half of all Americans, or when, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are all these kind of big headline level scandals around data, but data runs so deep in our lives. I mean, it's such a deep part of who we are. I mean, just think about our experiences at a place like this at the university, myself being a teacher, and the ways in which all of my students are encouraged in so many ways to live their lives through the calendars and schedules of their educational transcripts. And, I might not be the biggest fan of some of the grading systems that we use in higher education, but I don't think they're, I don't think they exhibit the same kind of problems that we find, the same level of problem that we find when we're talking about some of these headline scandals. In other words, there are all kinds of predictive data apparatus that we live within that operates in ways not that's innocent, but isn't obviously guilty. And I think many of these apparatus and instruments can be shown to be innocent and can be shown to do good, to do well.
Hi, Colin. Great talk. So, perhaps predictably, I'm going to ask a question about politics.
Okay.
Which I realize is not the arena, but it came up when you were talking about the woman who was in charge of the birth department setting up the initial steps.
Julia Lathrop, yeah.
Julia Lathrop, yeah. So I'm wondering, and at the end when you talk about, okay, how do we change law and politics around this? So I'm wondering, in your research, did you find any evidence about the debates folks were having at the outset of setting up these kind of standardization forms? It seems like it aligns with a lot of the progressive areas values of rationalization, scientification of government in order to do some good in the world. So, and part of that, of course, was an emphasis on democracy. So I'm wondering whether the debates that we're having then, they help inform or shape our discussions now that might be helpful. Because it seems like, we went from this progressive era, perhaps democratically, at least in its ideal form, to nowadays when we're talking about software standards, for example, you have things like the ISO, the National Standards Organization, which is made up of representatives who are sent by corporations who are supposedly representing state interests, right? And they're the ones that design all the standardization of software these days. So it seems like we've gone in a very sort of, I hate to use the word, but neoliberal direction of things over the years. So I'm wondering if there's anything you found in your research about the kind of political debates that were being had at the time that might help us now.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely share with you this sense that if you were to set those two political environments 100 years apart next to one another, the first is largely operating within a context of progressive ideals of the administrative state, whatever one happens to think of those, and the latter, I don't know. I wouldn't be happy to characterize it as neoliberal. I'd just be happy to characterize it as unregulated or minimally regulated. I'm not really sure what neoliberal means, but that's an academic debate, which I'm happy to have later over drinks. But I think there's a big difference that you're pointing to in terms of a lot of the context for some of the projects that I'm looking at in the early 20th century were what I think most of us today would recognize as progressive social ideals. So, I mentioned public health campaigns for lowering infant mortality. So imagine you're a public health official who's committed to lowering infant mortality. How are you going to know if you've met with any success in what you do if you don't have reliable data about how many infants there are Right? I mean, this is like such a kind of everyday furniture of our lives today that it's difficult to kind of go back. It's difficult to envision ourselves back to a time before these sorts of informational infrastructure were built. And there was, as you're pointing to, vigorous public debate in those decades around the viability of these goals, the relative priority that various of these goals should have. And so, I guess in many ways I would agree with you that, we need more of that debate today around viability of different kinds of tech regulation, different kinds of policy suites in terms of getting a grip on either unregulated or neoliberal tech conglomerates.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. My mind started racing back to the early 20th century. And you talk about, at that point in time, the development of science and government based on data. But what I was thinking, it was a time in which there was rapid state formation, expansion of the nation state. There was also the expansion of a market economy, and it was also a time of wars that sort of go into the pot. And I guess the piece to me that's kind of missing in your talk is also the expansion of propaganda, because you have Bernays coming on in the 1920s in marketing and coming up with their own particular use of data, both in terms of using data and creating data for expanding markets. So would you please address the factor that the emergence of propaganda, the science of psychoanalysis and psychology, and how that fits into the emergence of the big data systems?
Not having done an exhaustive survey of the early 20th century, I guess what I would think about that is that this is yet one more example, unsurprisingly, of a domain that in the early 20th century is being subject to then emerging informational dynamics. I don't have anything, I haven't studied the history of propaganda. I don't really have anything special to say about it. There may be some specialists in this room. But I mentioned I have these 3 chapters, one on psychometrics or datification of the mind, one on datification of the body in terms of the real estate market and ways in which race gets factored into real estate valuations, and then datification of identity in terms of identity paperwork. I mean, when you think about those 3 things set next to one another, they don't all seem to be of a piece. It seems like a disparate story. And that's intentional, because the thing that runs through all of them and runs through domain after domain after domain in this time is datification, informationalization. And you find those dynamics at play just across such wide swaths of society at that time. But the way that they actually play out in any given domain is, it's not always going to play out in the same way. But if we see it playing out in the formation of industries of propaganda, that's not surprising, and that's one more resonance we have now with the emergence of newer industries of propaganda.
So Foucault liked to say that we are what has been said. Is it now more true to say we are what has been collected?
I want to say we are what has been formatted.
Good. That's why I asked.
Collection, to me, already implies formatting.
Thanks.
It already implies data that has been cooked, that can be dealt with, that can be stored, such that it can be processed, such that it can be disseminated. But again, we're not just that. We're also the many other things that we are. So this is an additional layer to who we are. And I don't want to tell the story that we're just our data, because that would be the reductive story. We're obviously many other things. But we've also become people who live our lives through this. So we're formatted.
Thank you, Colin. I wanted to kind of get to something that you had up at the corner of your beautiful schematic, and at the same time seem to be at the kind of foundations of where you started. And it's a simple question, I guess. How should we imagine privacy given sort of the embeddedness, this embeddedness of ourselves as data subjects? So having gone through what you've done, kind of asking you to go back to